So I was talking to a friend recently about this podcast and the newsletter they sent out. And I was probably bemoaning the fact that, I have a small audience and an audience that I appreciate. But, I'd like to have hundreds of thousands of people listening to each of these episodes. And he was like, well, why? Why would you want that? And I thought about it extemporaneously and said something like, the more I do these recordings, the more I think of them as teaching, right? And that was a shift that I needed to make internally to see these as teaching, that there's something worth saying, that there's something worth teaching, and there's something I can say that's interesting and useful. And, your mileage may vary about how applicable any of those statements are to you. And certainly there's room for additional clarification. But then it occurred to me, even deeper underneath that idea of teaching, is the idea that, that the subjects that I talk about because they're important and allow me to examine my life in a way that is interesting and creative and necessary. I want to flip that and say, look, here's a process I've gone through with this poem or this song or this piece of music, these ideas. While these particular poems, songs, ideas may not do the same for you, something will, and it is desperately important to find those things. And so here, in these sort of memoirs or diary entries or teachings, is a sense of urgency to find artifacts that are sustaining, whether those are, like I said, music, poetry, or psychogeography, right? Those are the things that feed and sustain me, and it implies a particular way of approaching things. And I think it's a way of approaching things that can be passed along and incorporated into your life, into different lives. So that seems like a useful thing to try and get across, like more plainly than what I just said, and certainly more than I do like on my webpage or in the descriptions of the podcast. There's an urgency to explain this this pattern of connection and ideas. There's an essay that George Orwell wrote called Why I Write. And after that conversation, when I was trying to think about how I could articulate why I podcast, ideally in a single sentence, like if I could really zero down, and I haven't yet, obviously I'm still trying to figure it out. I thought I would reread that George Orwell essay. So at the end of the Orwell essay, he basically lands on the political necessity of his writing. That if there wasn't, if he didn't feel there was a political message, then he would not feel the push to go through the process of writing. Now, to get there, he talks about the process of writing and some of the reasons that people write. And I'm going to summarize this as 4 of them. But the first thing that he does is gives a bit of his background. What kind of a child he was, what kind of a young person he was. And he says that is necessary when you want to understand why someone is writing. He feels, and I agree with him, that early formative experiences will shape the material that becomes of interest to the mature writer or the mature podcaster. So I was looking back at that and thinking, do I have the reflective capability to describe my childhood or my adolescence in such a way that I could see a thread in terms of how I approach the material that I'd like to podcast about now? And I can't yet, but there is a posture that I take towards my material, and I've called it the psychogeographic stance, or stepping a moment outside of time, or considering the 4-minute halo. If you're told with absolute certainty that you have 4 minutes left to live, the quality of your thoughts changes. Because that's what it is now. The fantasies, the delusions, the narratives, the ideas, the desires, the fears, all of those become enormously concrete as a halo around the individual. And what if you were to walk around with that perception of the halo of thoughts and feelings in every moment, that every moment had that same clarity and concreteness about it? But that requires this sort of, do you know what I'm saying? Like this, just step back a little bit. So yeah, I think I approach my topics with that step-asidedness, the quality of having stepped aside for just a moment. And in the best stuff, the stuff that really works, you can see a unity of an experience around something, a piece of music that can be held or can be beheld. Because now it's no longer passing through time; it's an object or an artifact, or the idea that a human life is an object or an artifact that we experience as this unfolding. But if you step outside, it's this thing, isn't it? The beginning, a middle, something happens, development, and then an end. It follows the same envelope as a piece of music. And I think if what I do as a musician or as a composer or as a podcaster prompts that flip, then I will consider to be successful. All right, so Orwell talks about 4 reasons why people write. And he's clear that everyone has some element of all of these. But there may be one that's a bit weighted heavier than the others. The first one he describes is sheer egoism, the desire to be clever, to be talked about, to be remembered after death. Everyone has this. He's very clear that he has this. Every writer that he's known writes. So of the 4, you can just assume that the ego and the seriousness of the will to write is a major driver, and that if that wasn't there, you will probably not pick up a pen. So with that in the background, then there is aesthetic enthusiasm, which he describes as a desire to share an experience which one feels is valuable and ought not to be missed. Which is very much, I think, what I was talking about, that sort of psychogeographic stance to flip perception into this sort of concretized unity. Yeah, something like that, right? But the idea that there's a phenomenon that can be experienced, documented, recreated, and shared. Underneath this aesthetic enthusiasm, Orwell also talks about the pleasure of the impact of one sound on another. And again, I think that that resonates with me in particular. This second one is one I feel close to. I often write words that are syntactically not quite right, but just the not quite rightness of the sound of them is delightful to me. You'll see that in the essays I've written. You'll read it and you'll think, that is not the right word. And most of the time it's something that wasn't the right word. I misspelled the correct word, and then in correcting it, corrected it to the wrong word. Or I couldn't quite get the word that I was thinking about. And so I came up with a word that sounded similar, began with the same letter, had the same number of syllables. And then ended up keeping that word as what had originally been a placeholder became the word that I used. Aesthetic enthusiasm is the second. So sheer egoism and aesthetic enthusiasm. I think of the four, those are the two that dominate my thinking. But then there's the third one, historical impulse, the desire to see things as they are, to find out true facts and store them up for the use of posterity. Yeah, so not so much in my work, right? Although I totally get the idea of wanting to see things as they are. Some of the writings about meditation, or a lot of my drive to meditate, if you ask me why do I meditate, well, one of the reasons is I want to understand what's going on. So it's a little bit different from what Orwell means here, but I think there's an overlap. And then the last one is political purpose. And Orwell says, he uses the word political in the widest possible sense. The desire to push the world in a certain direction. Now, he's very clear, no writing is free from political bias. But some writers are driven by that, first and foremost. And I mentioned he lumps himself in with that. His experience in India as a policeman, then his experience with the Spanish Civil War, and ultimately with the rise of fascism in Germany. His writing has a compulsion to identify injustice. So then he ends the essay, he says, looking back through my work, I see that it is invariably where I lacked a political purpose that I wrote lifeless books and was betrayed into purple passages, sentences without meaning, decorative adjectives, and humbug generally. So there you go, George Orwell, Why I Write.